Chapter 4, Paradise Oscar. I'm Not Afraid on the Open Road was part of a poem the teacher had read to them at school. It was about a boy who also was out alone at night. Rasmus ought not to be any more afraid than that boy, but still it was awful to be all alone. He wasn't used to it. At the orphanage there were always children around. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to be by yourself there, you had either to go to the bathroom or to climb into the linden tree. It was a rare treat to be alone at Vastahagga, but to be out alone on this chilly, windless night with its pale stars wasn't like anything Rasmus had ever experienced before. The stillness and the weird light, which made everything look so unreal, frightened him. Once in a dream he had seen the countryside flooded in strange light, but he hadn't known that a summer night was like this outside a dream. Shivering and miserable, he ran along the road as fast as he could, his bare feet slapping against the ground. He was in a hurry because he was afraid of meeting people who might suspect that he had run away. But a little farther along there was a shortcut through the fields which must also lead out into the world. It was a narrow, winding road where only timber carts came through in winter and milk wagons in the summer when the cows were grazing nearby. There he wouldn't have to be afraid of meeting anyone who would wonder what he was doing out alone at that hour of night. But at the fork in the road he hesitated. It looked so ghostly in there among the hazel shrubs, and the poplars were rustling and sighing, although there was no breeze stirring. I'm not afraid on the open road. If only Gunnar had been along. If only he had someone to hold by the hand. The shadows were so deep, and the whole world was as quiet as if it were dead. All the birds and animals were asleep, and all people too. Only he was out here alone and afraid, terribly afraid on the open road, is what he was, and not at all as brave as the little boy in the poem. It's so far away, deep into the forest, the poem continued, and how true that was. On top of everything, he was so hungry. He pulled the zwieback out of his pocket and ate it, but his stomach still felt just as empty, and he wondered anxiously whether there were any kind people in the world who would give a lonely orphan something to eat, even if he did have straight hair and wouldn't be suitable for adoption. He was getting terribly tired too. He had to try to find a place where he could sleep, but not just yet. He had to get away, far away from Vastahagga as possible, before dawn, before they discovered that he wasn't in his bed. Just think what commotion that was going to make. Maybe the hawk would send the police after him. The very thought made him walk faster. With his hands in his pockets and his shoulders hunched, he trudged along the road, staring straight ahead, careful not to look to either side in the dark where the shadows loomed. He walked on, feeling terribly abandoned and alone. The short summer night could be endless if you keep going until your feet refuse to move. Your eyelids close and you stumble along nodding, practically asleep. The dawn comes and the first rays of sun filter through the streets, but you don't see it. Dewdrops glitter on the cobwebs and on the leaves of the wild flowers. The light morning mist vanishes into nowhere, and in a birch tree close by a thrush, fresh as the morning, raises his voice in jubilation, but you don't notice it. You're so tired, you're way beyond caring. At last Rasmus came to a little gray barn, just the kind that tramps like to sleep in. It was in a field and looked so inviting. At that time of the year, such field barns were filled with hay. With great effort, Rasmus pushed open the heavy door. It was dark and still in there, and the hay had such a strong good smell. With a sigh that was almost a sob, he threw himself down, and in an instant was fast asleep. He awoke because he was cold, and because a straw was tickling his nose. He flew up with a start, not remembering where he was or how he had got there. But then it all came back to him, and a feeling of utter loneliness brought tears to his eyes. He was more miserable than he could have imagined. He was already homesick for Vastohaga, Gunnar, his warm bed, and the morning cereal. Now he thought of the orphanages as a lost paradise. Of course, there was the possibility of being thrashed from time to time, but it still wasn't as bad as being all alone in the world and cold and hungry like this. A small streak of sunlight filtered in through a crack in the wall. His first thought was that since the day was beautiful, it would also be less cold. He was wearing his heavy sweater and his gray homespun pants, which Aunt Olga had patched at the knees. But despite that, he was so cold that his teeth chattered. He would have preferred to lie down and go back to sleep, but it wasn't possible. Cold as he was, shivering, he sat there in the hay, miserably watching the flecks of dust whirling around in the sunlight. Then he heard something which sent a cold streak of terror through his whole body, from his head to his toes. Someone was yawning very close to him. He wasn't alone. Someone else had been sleeping there too. The only parts of him able to move were his eyes, which wandered around trying to discover the source of this horror. Then he saw a curly brown tuft of hair stick up behind a big manger right next to him. He heard a groan, and a voice sang, "Ho-hum, I'm tired day and night, but worst of all in the morning." Then a head stuck out from behind the manger, showing a round, unshaven face with a dark beard. Two eyes stared at him in amazement, and then the round face broke into a broad smile. The man didn't look so dangerous, and his whole body seemed to chuckle as he said, "Hi there." "Hi," said Rasmus hesitatingly. "Golly, you look scared. You think I eat children." When Rasmus didn't answer, he continued, "Who are you, and what is your name?" "Rasmus," came the hesitant reply. Rasmus was afraid to answer and afraid not to. "Rasmus, oh Rasmus," said the bearded man, nodding thoughtfully. "Did you run away from home?" "No, not from home," said Rasmus, and he didn't feel as if he were telling a lie. Vasterhaga wasn't a real home, in any case. How could the man possibly think you'd want to run away from a real home? "Don't look so terrified," the man said. "I've told you I don't eat children." Rasmus plucked up his courage. "Did you run away from home?" he asked cautiously. The bearded man roared with laughter. "Have I run away from home? Yes, that's probably it," he said, and laughed still harder. "Are you a tramp?" asked Rasmus. "Call me Oscar," the man said, as he raised himself in the hay, and Rasmus saw that he must be a tramp because he was wearing such scruffy clothes, a checkered raggy jacket and trousers which had no shape at all. He was big and burly and kind-looking, and when he laughed his white teeth gleamed in his dark bearded face. "Tramp is right. Haven't you ever heard of Paradise Oscar? That's me, the Paradise Tramp, and God's best friend, that's me." God's best friend. Rasmus began to wonder if that tramp was all right in the head. "Why are you God's best friend?" asked Rasmus. Many deep wrinkles appeared on Oscar's forehead. "Someone has to be, and what's more, there has to be a tramp who is God's best friend. God approves of tramps." "Does he?" said Rasmus suspiciously. "Yes, he does," Oscar assured him. When he has gone to so much trouble to put the world together, he wants to have everything in it. Don't you understand? How would it look if there was everything except tramps?" Oscar nodded, apparently pleased with his explanation. "God's best friend. Yes, sir, that's me." Then he pulled out a big package wrapped in newspaper from a rucksack lying next to him in the hay. "A little breakfast is going to hit the spot." As he said it, Rasmus felt as if his stomach were about to tie itself into knots from hunger. He was so hungry he was ready to start chewing on the hay like a cow. "I have a bottle of milk standing outside here somewhere," said Oscar. In one leap he was at the door. It squeaked and moved heavily on its hinges as he pushed it open. A broad carpet of sunshine flowed into the barn. Oscar stood still for a moment, stretching himself in the sun, but then he disappeared. He was back in a second with a well-corked wine bottle full of milk. "Yes, sir, a little breakfast is going to taste mighty good," he said, making himself comfortable in the hay. He unwrapped the newspaper and pulled out big, thick sandwiches made of rye bread. With a contented grunt, he sank his teeth into one. Rasmus saw that it had ham in it, his favorite kind of sandwich. Oscar also seemed to like ham. He would take a bite, look hungrily at the sandwich, and take another bite. Rasmus turned white with hunger. He tried to look in another direction, but it was impossible. The sandwich drew his eyes like a magnet, and he felt his mouth begin to water. Oscar stopped chewing. He put his head to one side and looked teasingly at Rasmus. "I don't suppose you would like a plain ham sandwich," he said. "Your kind probably eat cereal with raisins for breakfast. An ordinary ham sandwich probably wouldn't appeal to you. Do you say no when the splendors of heaven are offered?" "Yes, thank you," said Rasmus, and swallowed hard. "Yes, thank you, please." Without a word, Oscar handed him a sandwich. It was wonderfully thick and long, and there were 2 big slices of ham in it. Rasmus took a bite, and oh, the taste of the ham, blending with the rich, coarse rye bread. He closed his eyes and ate. "Milk," said Oscar, and Rasmus opened his eyes again. Oscar handed him a tin mug filled to the brim, and he drank in deep draughts. It made his stomach cold, and he was even colder than before, but that made no difference. He kept on drinking just the same until there wasn't a single drop left. "More sandwich," said Oscar, and without a word shoved another torpedo-sized one in his direction. "May I? Can you spare it?" "Yes, go ahead," said Oscar. "Not all farmers' wives are stingy. The one who gave me these must have had a feeling that I would meet up with you." They sat there quietly in the hay, eating away until there wasn't a crumb left. They finished the milk, and Rasmus felt his stomach getting colder. "Thank you very much," he said, shivering. "That was the best meal I've ever eaten." "But you're blue in the face," said Oscar. "You'll have to get out in the sun and warm up." Oscar got up and put on his rucksack and started to walk toward the door. Rasmus saw his big, broad frame in the opening, and he realized that Oscar was about to leave. The thought was unbearable. Oscar couldn't leave him alone. "Oscar," he said in such a panic that he could hardly get the words out. "Oscar, I would like to be a paradise tramp like you." Oscar turned around and looked at him. "Boys like you shouldn't become tramps. You should stay at home with your father and mother." "I don't have a father and mother," said Rasmus. Oh, if Oscar would only understand how alone he was and take pity on him. He leaped out of the hay and caught up with Oscar. "I don't have parents," he said, "but I'm looking for some." He eagerly took Oscar's hand. "Can't you let me go on the road with you while I'm looking?" "What is it you're looking for?" Oscar asked. "For someone who wants me," said Rasmus. "Don't you think there might be someone who would like a boy with straight hair?" Flabbergasted, Oscar looked into the thin, freckled face that was so anxiously turned up toward him. "Yes, sure," he said. There are people who would like a boy with straight hair. The important thing is that he is honest. I'm honest, Rasmus assured him. That is, more or less, he added. Perhaps it wasn't completely honest to run away from an orphanage. Oscar gave him a severe look. Please be good enough to tell me where you come from. Rasmus lowered his eyes and drilled his big toe into the ground, looking very unhappy. From Vasterhaga, from the orphanage. But I won't go back there, he said, emphatically, having already forgotten that a while ago he had been longing terribly to get back there. The only thing he was sure of it was that he wanted to be with Oscar, whom he had known for hardly an hour. Why did you run away? Asked Oscar. Did you do something bad? Yes, he said, nodding slowly. I poured water on Miss Hawk. Oscar laughed, but checked himself. So, you're the mischievous kind, eh? But you haven't stolen anything, I hope. Yes, said Rasmus, covered with guilt and shame. Then I can't have you as a pal, said Oscar. If you steal when you're a tramp, then you're finished. The sheriff will get to you before you have a chance to blow your nose. No, sir, I can't have you as a partner. Rasmus clung to him in a panic. Please, please, Oscar, he begged. Please doesn't do any good, said Oscar. What did you steal? Rasmus frantically dug in the ground with his big toe. Again, a Zwieback, he said quietly, when I was going to run away to have something to eat. A Zwieback? Oscar laughed so heartily that his white teeth flashed. That doesn't count. Rasmus was tremendously relieved. Could I get to be one of those God's best friends anyway? Yes, they're not that fussy up there, Oscar assured him. Will you let me be your partner then? Said Oscar. You can come along for a while, and we'll see how we get along together. Thank you very much, Oscar, said Rasmus. I already get along together. Then they started walking. The sun was still low in the sky, but the village was slowly beginning to come to life. In the distance they heard a rooster crowing, dogs were barking, and on the road an empty hay cart rattled by, drawn by two skinny horses. A sleepy farmhand stood upright in the cart, holding the reins. Let's ask if we can ride with him, suggested Rasmus. You'll do no such thing. You have to lie low for a while. You never know. Miss Hawk may be so crazy about you that she'll ask the sheriff to find you and bring you back. Do you think she'd do that? Said Rasmus, shivering with both cold and fear. I guess she'll wait a couple of days first. She'll probably be thinking that you'll turn up when you're hungry. But I won't, said Rasmus, desperately trying to stifle a yawn. I didn't sleep much last night, he said, by way of apology. He was still desperately tired and sleepy, but he didn't want to be any trouble to Oscar, who was tramping along in such a free and easy manner, taking such long steps. So, you would like to hit the sack. Oscar glanced at the poor exhausted frozen boy, who was half running beside him to keep up. Come on, we'll find a place where you can get warm and where you can sleep. I can't sleep in the middle of the day, said Rasmus, astonished. I've only just got up. Tramps can sleep any time, Oscar assured him. Then it dawned on Rasmus what it meant to be a tramp. In an instant, the wonderful aspects of this new life were revealed to him. You could do exactly what you pleased. You could eat and sleep and go exactly where you pleased. You were free, wonderfully free, like a bird in the forest. Completely dazzled by his discovery, he trudged along at Oscar's side. He already felt like a tramp, and looked at his surroundings with the eyes of a tramp. He looked at the road winding softly through the landscape ahead of them, and seeming to hold exciting things in store behind every bend. The cows were contentedly chewing. their cuds in lush green fields, and outside the farmers' red cottages, dairy maids were washing milk bottles, and the farm hands were pumping water into troughs for the horses. In the houses, children were crying, and outside chained dogs were barking and straining at their leashes. In the dairies, lonely calves were mooing for the freedom of their fields. Rasmus saw and heard it all through the eyes and ears of a tramp. Oscar was walking along, singing happily to himself. Suddenly he turned off the road and stopped in a sunny clearing, behind some high juniper bushes. "You can sleep here for a while," said Oscar. "There's shelter and sun here, and no one can see you from the road." Rasmus began to yawn, but a terrible thought made him stop with his mouth wide open. "Oscar, you promised not to go away while I'm sleeping." Oscar nodded. "Just you go ahead and sleep," he said. Rasmus threw himself down on his stomach and burrowed his nose into the fold of his sleeve. The sun warmed him so wonderfully, and he was so sleepy. As he was sinking deeper and deeper, he felt Oscar spreading his jacket over him. Now he wasn't cold any longer. He was lying on a floor of thyme, breathing in the good, spicy smell. The warmth of the sun also brought out the fragrance of the juniper bushes. These were summer smells, and all his life they would bring back to him this summer day on the road. A bee came buzzing over his head. With an effort he opened one eye to look at it, and he saw Oscar sitting there, chewing on a blade of grass. Then he fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 5. A Day on the Road. "Please, lady, could you spare some food for me and my partner?" Oscar was standing at the kitchen door, bowing politely, his cap in hand. "Are you on the road again, Paradise Oscar?" said the farmer's wife disapprovingly. "It isn't so long ago that I gave you a whole meat loaf." "So you did," said Oscar, "but I was lucky enough to live through it." Rasmus grinned, and the farmer's wife gave him a dark look. "Who is that youngster you are dragging around?" "Oh, it's a poor heathen I've picked up," said Oscar with mock seriousness. "We are looking for a civilized home for him. You don't happen to need a handy little heathen around the house?" "Heathen yourself," the farmer's wife furiously swished the dish rag over the kitchen table, sweeping crust of bread, potato peels, and spilled milk onto the floor. She was making it very plain that she disliked tramps, and Rasmus almost wished that they would leave again. But this was the first farm kitchen he had been in, and he had to use the chance to look around. It certainly didn't smell as good as the kitchen at Vasterhaga. Here there was a smell from the garbage pails over by the sink, which were destined for the pigs, and sour rags, and a strange undefinable house smell that he had never met before. He was lucky that they didn't want him on this farm, because he wouldn't have wanted to stay here. They had children enough without him, a whole raft of fat, pasty-faced ones who stood gaping at him, probably because Oscar had said he was a heathen. "If you chop some wood for me, I'll give you something to eat later," said the woman grouchily. Oscar put his head to one side and looked pleadingly at her. "Do I have to chop wood? Can I play you a little tune instead?" "Thanks, I can get along without that," the woman growled, but she no longer looked quite so forbidding. "That's life," Oscar said, nodding sadly. "Chopping wood, me, just goes to show what you can get yourself into while peacefully walking along the road, minding your own business." "Get out to the woodshed and no nonsense," said the woman, but she no longer looked so grouchy. Oscar and Rasmus moved quickly toward the door. "How are we supposed to know where the woodshed is?" Rasmus asked. "Ha, I could find it in the dark if I had to," said Oscar. "When I get even close to a woodshed, my legs start protesting, and then I say to myself, 'There it is,' and you can bet I'm right." He went into the shed, which was indeed the woodshed. picked up the axe that lay on the chopping block, and began chopping. Quickly and efficiently he split the big chunks of cord wood. Rasmus picked up the logs and piled them into the cart, which was obviously used to fetch wood. "My, you're good at chopping wood," said Rasmus, "but you're awfully lazy, aren't you?" Oscar nodded. "Yes, as far as work goes. I can get along on very little. Didn't anyone ever offer you a job?" "Yes, it has happened, but on the whole people are usually nice to me," said Oscar, and he continued philosophically, "It's like this, you see. Sometimes I want to work, and then I want to work very hard, but sometimes I don't want to work at all. People seem to think you have to work all the time, and that I can't get into my poor head." "I couldn't get that into my poor head either when I was at Vesterhaga," said Rasmus, admitted. Now the cart was full, and Oscar stopped chopping. From his rucksack, which was standing nearby, he pulled out a small accordion, carefully wrapped up in a piece of red blanket. "Now we're going to play a little tune, and the old woman can do what she likes." He let his fingers roam over the keys, and the notes came out like deep sighs. But then he really got into the spirit, and the woodshed was filled with the most wonderful music that Rasmus had heard in all his life. "Her hair is as black as the darkest night. Is it so strange that she's on my mind?" sang Oscar in a big, warm voice which made Rasmus tingle with pleasure. This was much better than listening to Miss Hawks playing from Zion's songs on the organ at home. Rasmus made himself comfortable on the chopping block and thoroughly enjoyed himself. The pasty-faced children stood at a distance, quietly listening. The farmer's wife had made herself an excuse for going to the rhubarb patch right next to where Oscar was. She was energetically breaking off rhubarb stalks and pretending that she neither saw nor heard Oscar. But when he stopped singing, she came up and said in an almost friendly way, "You can go in and eat now." "Fried herring and potatoes, just like Mother used to make," said Oscar, and he slapped his knees in a happy anticipation. Rasmus felt the same way. He hadn't eaten a home-cooked meal since he left Vesterhaga, and the smell of herring and onions made his mouth water. The woman generously put before him 5 big potatoes and almost a whole herring, and he was beginning to like her. But while he was eating, she eyed him curiously, and at last she said, "You know, Oscar, that boy is too small to be wandering around on the roads." Oscar had his mouth so full that he almost couldn't talk. "Sure, I know," he said, "but it isn't for long. I was only joking before. The boy is on his way to his father and mother." That was true, thought Rasmus. As soon as he found someone who wanted him, he wouldn't be a tramp any more. But there was no hurry to find a father and mother. Now, he wanted to look around first, and it was wonderful to be on the road with Oscar. He most certainly didn't want to be apart from him yet. But maybe Oscar felt that it was a nuisance to have him along. Perhaps he was anxious to find parents for him as soon as possible. When they started walking again, he asked about it. "Do you want to get rid of me, Oscar?" Oscar had already fallen into his marching step. "When I want to get rid of you, I'll tell you," he said. This answer wasn't so very reassuring. Suppose that Oscar told him before he found a new home. What in the world would he do then? He had been alone for a night on the road, and that was something he didn't want to repeat ever again. He looked timidly at Oscar. He would be so good and so careful not to cause any trouble if only Oscar wouldn't get tired of him. "Oscar, I can carry my sweater myself," he said eagerly. But Oscar didn't think that was a very good idea. What would be the sense in that when I can put it in the rucksack? The weight makes no difference." Oscar walked along at his regular pace, and Rasmus took as big steps as he could so as not to fall behind. "Do you want me to hold your hand, Oscar?" he asked, out of breath when he could no longer keep up. Oscar stopped and gave him a long look. "Yes, thank you," he said. "Please do. Hold my hand like a good boy so that I won't fall behind." Rasmus put his hand in Oscar's, and they continued at a slower pace. "I'm not used to this yet," Rasmus mumbled apologetically. He realized that Oscar had slowed down for his sake. "No, of course, you don't become an expert vagabond overnight," Oscar admitted. Then he showed Rasmus how to walk in a steady, even trot. "But we don't have to rush as if we had to get to the end of the world before nightfall," said Oscar. "If we get there tomorrow, it's soon enough." Rasmus trudged along, overflowing with gratitude, because Oscar was so nice. He felt that he wanted to pay him back in some way, make a really big sacrifice for Oscar's sake, or give him something so that he would understand how much Rasmus liked him without his having to say it. They passed one of those little country stores where you could buy everything from rakes, boots, and kerosene to coffee and candy, but alas, it was a paradise open only to those who had money. Longingly, Rasmus looked in through the open door, and his feet seemed to stop by themselves. It would have been so wonderful to stay a while and look around, but Oscar wasn't going to do any window shopping. He was already well ahead. With a sigh, Rasmus hurried to catch up with him. Then he happened to put his hand in his pocket, and there was the 5-cent piece. He had forgotten all about it during the exciting happenings of the last 24 hours. He was overjoyed when he felt the coin between his fingers. What a marvelous thing a 5-cent piece was. "Oscar, do you like butterscotch?" he asked in a voice trembling with excitement. "Of course I like butterscotch," said Oscar. "Everybody likes butterscotch. But I have no money right now, you see, so we can't buy any." "Yes, I can," said Rasmus, producing the coin. He was a little worried that Oscar would give him a lecture on thrift, but that worry proved unnecessary. "Well, isn't that dandy?" said Oscar. "Run over and buy some butterscotch with it then." Rasmus turned around and ran back. What wonderful luck that he happened to remember the money right here at the store, and he was luckier still that he hadn't spent it before now. He came back triumphantly to Oscar, who was sitting at the edge of the road waiting for him. It was a moment of indescribable delight to be able to open the bag and show Oscar 5 big pieces of butterscotch. Oscar put his head to one side and looked very hungry. "Now, let's see which one I want." "You have to take all of them," Rasmus cried eagerly. "I want you to take all of them." But Oscar waved this generosity aside with his hand. "No, moderation is everything. One of those is enough for me." That Oscar happened to be such a moderate butterscotch eater made him still more perfect in Rasmus' eyes. With all his heart he had wanted to give Oscar all 5 pieces, but he wasn't more than human, and besides, he was awfully fond of butterscotch. To be sitting there on the roadside, taking the paper off the deliciously sticky candy, was certainly one of the nicest ways of spending time that Rasmus could think of. You finally had to put the whole thing in your mouth to get the paper off. Then it came off easily, and there was only the chewy, wonderful butterscotch left. If you sucked it sparingly, it could last a long, long time. "Like this," said Rasmus, as he demonstrated the technique of slow sucking to Oscar. If Oscar had taught him how to walk, he would show Oscar how to eat butterscotch. For a long time they sat in the sunshine, sucking away, but no matter how economical they were, the butterscotch slowly but surely shrank, until finally all that was left was a syrupy taste in the mouth. "Let's save the others," suggested Oscar. "If we ever get into a tight spot, it might be nice to have a little butterscotch reserve." Little did he realize how right he was. When it began to get dark, they stopped by a small lake. It had been a warm day, and they had come a long way. Rasmus was exhausted, and at first all he wanted to do was to stretch out on a rock. But the longing for a swim got the better of him. He quickly stripped behind a bush. Oscar took a small mirror, some soap, and a razor out of his rucksack and began to lather his face. "Don't go out too far," he said. "The water nymph might come and take you." "Oh, pooh, I can't swim," said Rasmus, and with a little pang of regret he remembered how Gunnar and he had learned to swim in the river at home. It seemed at least 1,000 years ago. The water felt smooth and warm on his body, and it was so pleasant to swim around in it. All his tiredness seemed to vanish. The water lilies swayed as he swam by them. They had a lovely phosphorescent sheen to them. Was this perhaps the water nymph's own garden, where she picked water lilies on summer nights? Rasmus turned on his back and lay floating for a while, contemplating his big toes, which stuck up out of the water. Along the shore everything was still. On the other side of the lake a cuckoo was warbling such a melancholy chant that it somehow made Rasmus feel melancholy too. "That cuckoo is crazy," said Oscar. "Midsummer has come and gone, and he is supposed to turn into a hawk. Doesn't he know that? The teacher at school told us that it's only an old wives' tale, that the cuckoo turns into a hawk after midsummer." Rasmus called out from the water. "Prove it," said Oscar. "Prove? You are supposed to be God's best friend, so you shouldn't need much proof." "No, you're right there." Oscar had finished shaving, and now he got out a brass comb and started to work on his curly hair. "You're awfully smart to be so little." In a neighboring field some cows were grazing. They came up to the fence and stood and stared at the trespassers. One of the cows lumbered heavily down to the water to drink, and from her bell came a clear little tinkle. Summer sounds, thought Rasmus. As he lay there in the water, the only sounds he could hear were the tinkling of that bell, the cuckoo over on the other side of the lake, and the little splashings of his own movements in the water. Oscar was also aware of these summer sounds, because as he sat there trying to untangle his hair, he absent-mindedly started to sing. "Now we have summer, now we have sun, now we have buttercups in the meadows." Then he stopped singing and looked at himself in the mirror with a disgusted expression. His hair was just as unruly as before. With a shrug he put the comb back in the rucksack. "Aren't you coming for a swim?" Rasmus called out to him. "No, but I'm going to wash my feet." Oscar pushed his trouser legs up and ventured cautiously into the water. "I've already had a bath," he said. "When?" "Last year, in honor of our royal family," said Oscar. "It was my 15th, the Queen's name day, and cold as the dickens. I don't want to do that over again. It's just as easy to keep clean bit by bit." "How are you going to prove that?" said Rasmus. "Like this," said Oscar, but just then he slipped and fell. He sat in the water up to his waist, looking stunned. Rasmus shouted with laughter, and Oscar glowered at him. "As I started to say, I'll show you," he growled when he had managed to get up on his feet again. But he was no longer in a bad humor. Sitting on a rock, he carefully washed his feet, and then waded back to the shore in his wet pants, singing a snatch of a song to himself about summer and sun and swimming in the sea. "Oscar, I like you," Rasmus shouted after him, and he didn't know himself what made him do it just then. It was time to have supper. Oscar had made a fire between the rocks to dry his pants, and to keep away the mosquitoes, and to be like Indians, added Rasmus, creeping as close to the fire as he could. During the afternoon they had stopped at a big estate, and been given milk and sandwiches to take with them, because Oscar had sung and played for all he was worth, songs about Ida's grave and the lion's bride, and a lot of others that Rasmus had never heard before. Now, as he was taking the sandwiches out of their newspaper wrapping, he noticed that there was a story about those robbers in the paper too. No sign of the Sandow robbers, it said. The police are combing the area. Rasmus showed Oscar the article. Where is Sandow? He asked. It's about 3 or 4 miles from here, said Oscar. Rasmus spread out the sandwiches on the rock. The ones with the cheese are Lion's Bride sandwiches, and the ones with the sausage are Ida's grave sandwiches, he said. And this is the Avesta waterfall, said Oscar, as he tilted the bottle of milk into his mouth. Rasmus hungrily wolfed a sausage sandwich. She was so nice and pretty, the lady of that house, he said dreamily, but she already had 2 girls with curls. Otherwise she could have had you. Yes, said Rasmus, and his eyes sparkled in the glow from the fire. Yes, that's it. I would like to live with someone who is pretty and rich. Ho-hum, said Oscar. Mosquitoes were buzzing around them, and as the fire died down they became bolder. Now we're going to fool those bloodsuckers by hitting the hay, said Oscar. He got some lake water in his mug, threw it on the embers, and packed his belongings together. There was a farmhouse close by. Oscar had been there before and asked for permission to sleep in the hayloft. Rasmus made himself comfortable and covered himself with hay so that only his nose stuck out. He wanted to give the mosquitoes as little of himself as possible. Are you all right? Oscar asked when he too had got settled. Yes, except for my hind legs. They feel a little weak, said Rasmus. Sleep will take care of that, said Oscar, and he yawned. Rasmus lay awake, listening to the rustling and snapping in the hay. He would have been frightened if Oscar hadn't been so close. From the barn below he heard the gentle rattling of chains. One of the animals was restless down there. Over him the mosquitoes buzzed stubbornly. That was the last thing he heard before he fell into a deep sleep.